What's the cringiest wedding you've ever been to? What happened? Story 1. This wedding took place in an Episcopal church, with the priest dressed in full ceremonial robes and the church beautifully decorated. The bride and groom, however, had asked guests to wear casual clothes. Most of us assumed that meant semi-formal attire. We were wrong. The couple and their children walked in wearing overalls and white t-shirts, standing next to the elaborately dressed priest. If that wasn't awkward enough, the groom decided to deliver a speech during the ceremony. He referenced the Bible verse, "Let the little children come to me," but twisted it into a message about listening to what children have to say. They were divorced within 2 years. To clarify, the groom's speech lasted about 20 minutes and was essentially the story of how they got together. A recurring theme was his uncertainty about the relationship, until his son encouraged him because he wanted a mom. The boy's biological mother had passed away when he was 4, and this was 8 years later. While the story itself was touching in some ways, the underlying message boiled down to, "I'm marrying her so my kid can have a mom." Not exactly the strongest foundation for a marriage. The priest and many attendees likely recognized that the biblical quote was being misinterpreted. The whole speech might have been more appropriate for the reception, but for some reason, he chose to share it during the ceremony. Story 2. At a wedding for some friends of my wife, the groom paused the reception to play a homemade video montage of their relationship. That alone wouldn't have been so bad, but the video was incredibly cheesy, set to an awkwardly out-of-place song. To make matters worse, while it played, the bride sat off to the side, laughing mockingly and taking tequila shots with her friends. Story 3. At my uncle's wedding, my dad pulled a prank on him by writing "Help me" in big blocky letters on the bottom of his shoes. When my uncle kneeled at the altar, the message was in full view, giving the immediate crowd a good laugh. Story 4. My family comes from a part of Pennsylvania where the dollar dance is a common wedding tradition. Guests put money in a basket for a quick dance with the bride, often receiving a shot of whiskey or a cigar in return. The twist? If anyone put in less than $20, they risked being dragged out back for a talk. Story 5. I attended a potluck wedding where guests were responsible for bringing food. The issue? They left their dishes sitting in hot cars throughout the church ceremony. When we finally moved to the reception hall, out came the potato salad, macaroni salad, and other perishables after an hour of baking in the heat. The high-end contributions were those questionable salads. Others brought bags of chips or 2-liter sodas. On top of that, they also had a dollar dance, where guests paid to dance with the bride. Since they ran out of pins to attach the bills to her dress, she started stuffing the money into her bra. Story 6. I went to my cousin's wedding. It was a second marriage for both, and they had only known each other for about 4 months. Instead of a unity candle or a traditional toast, they had something different. At the altar, the groom had a 6-pack of Dr. Pepper, and the bride had a 6-pack of Mountain Dew. After the priest declared them husband and wife, they kissed, immediately exchanged drinks, and chugged them. Story 7. I used to videotape weddings, so I've seen a lot of bizarre ceremonies. One of the most memorable was a New Jersey couple who looked straight out of reality TV. Think Jersey Shore levels of over-the-top style. During the church ceremony, their 60-year-old uncle, who was very much not Native American, suddenly stood up with feathers in his hair and started chanting around the church. No one knew what was going on, but it seemed like an attempt to appear spiritual or deep. As if that wasn't enough, they also included a sand mixing ceremony where they poured different colored sands into a vase as a symbol of their unity. The whole thing was a mix of flashy theatrics and forced sentimentality. Story 8. I grew up as a Jehovah's Witness, which, in my experience, is a very controlling environment. Dating was only allowed with the intent of marriage, and every interaction was closely monitored to ensure absolutely no physical contact before the wedding. The worst wedding I ever attended was an extremely small ceremony. Just the bride's family, the groom's family, and my family, all crammed into her grandmother's living room. But what really made it unbearable was the kiss. It wasn't just a kiss, it was an overly intense, drawn-out display. The groom practically tried to swallow the bride whole, with excessive tongue, heavy breathing, and awkward groping. It lasted for what felt like an eternity, and no one knew where to look. It was the most uncomfortable 5 minutes I've ever experienced. Story 9. My sister's wedding was an awkward mess. She and her husband were both top athletes in one sport, though she later switched to another. Our dad's speech started with a mildly embarrassing story about the groom denting his farm truck, but instead of wrapping it up, he launched into a full-blown sports history lesson. For what felt like ages, he recounted every detail of my sister's races, from the weather conditions to her finishing times. Then he started going around the room, calling out other athletes from both sports and listing their biggest achievements, insisting they stand up to be applauded. It was painful. My uncle had to interrupt him after multiple unsuccessful wrap-it-up gestures just so we could get to dessert. But right after that, my dad grabbed the mic again and tried to keep going. This time, everyone just laughed, and someone forcibly took the microphone away. Story 10. In November 2018, I attended a wedding for some friends of my in-laws. The couple was in their 60s and had been dating for decades before finally deciding to get married. The groom had served in the Navy, and since their wedding was close to Veterans Day, he invited a lot of fellow veterans from different military branches. During his reception speech, he surprised everyone by having the DJ play the military hymns for each branch, asking veterans to stand up as their song played. I understand he meant well, but it was awkward. None of the veterans knew this was coming, so they just looked around at each other, hesitated, and then slowly stood up. The civilian guests were left sitting there, unsure of what to do, while this went on for several long minutes. Later that night, the bride got really drunk with her friends, dancing barefoot on the floor. At one point, she lost her balance, rolled her ankle badly, and ended up in a mobility boot for a month. Story 11. This happened at my own wedding, and I still shake my head when I think about it. We had convinced a particular pastor to officiate, but somehow he found out that my spouse and I had been intimate before marriage. He decided the wedding ceremony was the perfect time to call that out. Then, when it was time for my vows, I got so overwhelmed with emotion that I started stumbling over my words, turning what I had written into an incoherent mess. If that wasn't enough, when I turned to get the ring from my best man, I found him full-on sobbing, so much so that he couldn't even find the ring. I can only imagine what the guests were thinking at that point. Story 12. I DJ'd a wedding for a couple who threw up multiple red flags from the start. They tried to get a discount in exchange for a positive review, which I didn't want, and they insisted I live mix their first dance. I'm a professional, so that wasn't an issue, but these two were far from professional dancers. Their dance was clunky and awkward, but their friends and family loved it because, well, they loved the bride and groom. After the reception, the groom even gave me a tip and told me I did an amazing job. Cut to the next morning, while they were likely still drunk. The groom emailed me with constructive criticism. A few emails later, he was demanding an apology and refusing to pay the remaining balance. Then he ghosted me. A few days later, the wedding coordinator reached out, saying I had to offer them a discount because they were upset about how their first dance looked. These two, who had no actual dance skills and pulled off an objectively bad routine, decided I was the reason they felt awkward. I told the coordinator they could keep their money. Story 13. My cousin's wedding was, hands down, the worst I've attended. The food was awful. Undercooked and ice cold when it should have been warm. There was music, but dancing was strictly forbidden because the couple didn't want people dancing at their wedding. On top of that, there was no alcohol, not a single drop. The worst part, the seating arrangement. They didn't bother keeping family or friends together. I was seated with complete strangers, and even our grandparents were separated. After an hour, my grandmother had enough. She got up, walked over to my grandfather, and they both announced they were leaving for a restaurant down the road to have a good meal and a beer. My parents and I immediately joined them. Before long, other guests noticed our empty seats, since no one was allowed to move around, and my uncle called to ask where we were. When we explained, he said, "Yeah, this is ridiculous," and ended up joining us. By the end of the night, about 20 guests from the wedding were crammed into a small restaurant having an actual good time. The couple never invited us to another event after that, which honestly was a relief. Story 14. I went to a wedding where the reception was a potluck. That wouldn't have been so bad, except the venue was actually nice. The couple was over an hour and a half late, and the best man had nothing prepared. So his speech painfully dragged on for 15 to 25 minutes. To make things worse, he casually mentioned that the newlyweds were going to have great sex now that they're married at a devout Christian wedding in front of a room full of church members. Since the reception started so late, by the time our table got to the buffet, we were left with whatever had been sitting in crock pots. Everything else was room temperature at best, and given that most of the food had likely been sitting in people's cars since morning, it was a gamble. To top it all off, the couple's church followed the no kissing before marriage rule. So, when the ceremony ended, the bride and groom started full-on making out at the altar. It got so uncomfortable that the pastor had to step in and say, "Okay, that's enough." The whole thing was bizarre. Story 15. When I was 8, I attended a wedding where the bride and groom replaced their thank you speech with an awards show format. The DJ would open an envelope, announce their names, and they'd walk up to accept their award, which was a Barbie and Ken doll. Then they'd give a speech thanking the guests, as if they had just won an Oscar. In the right hands, it could have been funny, but the problem was both the bride and groom were painfully shy. Instead of being entertaining, it was just incredibly awkward. I'm in my 30s now, and I still remember it. Story 16, a friend of a friend had a wedding that was something else. The bride was a young, small-town, ultra-religious woman who fell for a much older, already married man with 2 kids. Eventually, he left his wife but wanted nothing to do with his children. The wedding was held at her hometown church, and his vows were completely over the top. He sobbed through a dramatic speech about how he had never truly loved before, how she was the only woman he had ever wanted to marry, and how lonely he had been his whole life. Then it was her turn. She stood there in silence for several beats before being handed a microphone. The piano started playing, and she sang her vows, ones she had written herself. After the ceremony, we moved to the church basement for the alcohol-free reception. I somehow ended up in charge of serving the groom's cake, which consisted of 2 NASCAR-themed cakes with edible photos draped over them. The photos were impossible to cut through without destroying the cake, so I had to peel them off. Meanwhile, my friend was cutting the bride's cake, which was just plain cake covered in an inch-thick slab of fondant, no frosting at all. The buffet, a potluck from her family, featuring food you'd expect at a child's birthday party. The only drink option was pink punch. There was no dancing, of course, because of her religious beliefs. For their grand exit, they left for their honeymoon in the town's only hotel, a low-end motel, via a 2-horse-drawn carriage. Story 17. At one wedding, the groomsmen prepared a skit where they pretended to lose the groom at the reception. They launched into a performance filled with exaggerated gestures, hands on hips, and overly dramatic lines like, "Hey guys, aren't we forgetting something? Where could he possibly be?" It felt like a rejected scene from a bad high school musical. The guests were not in on the joke, so the entire room sat in silence, sipping their drinks and avoiding eye contact. The groomsmen, expecting applause, were met with dead air. As they made their exit, a single person muttered, "That was kind of weird." Story 18. At my own wedding, my brother and the wedding band surprised us with a beautiful rendition of a song by Juan Luis Guerra, our absolute favorite. It was a perfect, emotional moment, and there wasn't a dry eye in the room. But then my mother-in-law, who can't stand being outshined, decided to take over. She grabbed a distant cousin who we had never met and had him sing "My Heart Will Go On" from Titanic. He wasn't a good singer, and he played a terrible karaoke track from YouTube. It turned into a painfully awkward slow dance, made worse by the screeching feedback from trying to play the audio through a microphone. She was fuming when we cut it short. The beautiful moment my brother created, completely deflated. At least I can say we've been happily married for 10 years now, and needless to say, that part did not make it into our wedding video. Story 19. My cousin's wedding felt more like a Sunday sermon than a wedding ceremony. The pastor spent most of the time preaching rather than focusing on the couple. When he finally got to, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," instead of the expected kiss, the groom, his parents, and 3 or 4 random guests suddenly stood up, formed a circle, and held hands for a silent prayer. The rest of us sat there, confused, for several minutes, unsure if we were supposed to join in or just wait it out. Eventually, they finished, and the couple turned to walk out toward the reception. That's when the pastor suddenly realized they had never kissed, so he stopped them and told them to kiss before they left. The reception was dry, with no alcohol in sight. I did spot one guy with a beer, but he must have brought it himself because I couldn't find any anywhere. Story 20. My cousin and his wife are extremely religious and honestly, 2 of the most awkward people I've ever met. They attempted one of those fake-out first dances, where it starts with a slow song and then suddenly transitions into an upbeat dance number. It's already a risky move, but in this case, it was a full 5-minute song where they repeated the same handful of dance moves over and over. It felt like it would never end, and since it was a dry wedding, there was no alcohol to help ease the secondhand embarrassment. Story 21. Back in high school, one of my hockey teammates and his girlfriend had a baby during their junior year. They decided to get married, and the wedding was officiated by my teammate's dad, who also happened to be our hockey coach. The entire guest list consisted of the bride and groom's immediate family and our hockey team. The venue, a Golden Corral. The reception, also at Golden Corral. Afterward, we had a game that night. Somehow the other team found out about the wedding and spent the entire game heckling my teammate about it. They were relentless, but in the end it all worked out for him. 7 years later, he's an officer in the Air Force, has a second child, and coaches and refs hockey. He and his wife seem really happy together. They proved you don't need a fancy wedding to build a great life. Story 22. This couple decided to leave the city for a simpler life and bought an apple orchard. Naturally, their wedding theme was apples. Apples were everywhere. piled in baskets, scattered around the venue, decorating the tables, and even placed under small fake trees. The officiant wore an apple-patterned tie. Every dish at the reception included apples somehow. The wedding cake? Shaped like a giant apple. It was one of the strangest wedding aesthetics I've ever seen. Story 23. My brother-in-law is incredibly awkward and has no sense of emotional boundaries. He loves inserting himself into other people's special moments, singing, always a Ben Folds song, taking unsolicited videos to edit into a cheesy montage later, that sort of thing. My husband and I had a small non-traditional wedding with no designated maid of honor or best man. After our vows, we joined the crowd for a toast from our officiant, which was beautiful. But the second it ended, my brother-in-law shoved his way to the front, pulled out a massive notebook, and launched into a long, awkward roast of my husband. The problem? His jokes were full of obscure references that even my husband didn't remember. No one knew what he was talking about, and the room was filled with polite but confused silence. Thankfully, my sisters swooped in, encouraged him to wrap it up, and quickly redirected everyone's attention by inviting them to the buffet. The worst part? He had my father-in-law record the entire thing and later sent us the video as a gift. Safe to say, we did not keep it. Story 24. I attended a wedding for a former classmate. They were young, maybe 22 or 23. Apparently, in some places, there's a tradition where the couple smears cake on each other's faces after cutting it. The bride had made it crystal clear that she did not want that to happen. The groom ignored her wishes and went all in, smashing an entire slice of cake into her face. She was stunned for a moment before yelling, "You asshole, I told you not to do that," and storming off to the back of the venue. The groom tried to follow her, but the bridesmaids and her mother stopped him, so he just sat there awkwardly while half the wedding party rushed after the bride. She stayed hidden for about an hour. Eventually, they let him in to talk to her, but we could all hear the argument and her crying from outside. At some point, the reception just stalled completely until one of her aunts took charge, told the servers to start clearing the tables, and had the DJ put on some music. They divorced 2 years later. Story 25. Something very similar happened at my niece's wedding. Her new husband shoved cake in her face, and she completely lost it. Unlike the other story, though, she never calmed down. For the rest of the night, she was either in tears or yelling in anger. It got so bad that a lot of guests left early because it was obvious the entire event had turned into a disaster. I ended up spending most of the night outside with other guests, young and old, which was honestly the best part of the evening. The wildest thing? They're still married. Story 26. As a kid in Britain, I used to watch a CBBC show called Marrying Mum and Dad. Looking back, I hate that show. The premise was that kids got to plan their parents' wedding, choosing the theme, entertainment, and cake. Of course, since they were children, they picked the most ridiculous themes imaginable, things like Australia, medieval, space, or clowns. Guests had to show up dressed accordingly, and the couple had no idea what was coming. The kids would throw in some kind of fun activity, sometimes making their parents bungee jump, other times making them eat bugs. You could tell from the guests' faces that everyone felt secondhand embarrassment the entire time. At the end, the parents were expected to say how amazing their bug-eating, Australia-themed wedding was. It was peak cringe. Story 27. A friend's wedding was a series of disasters. The bride insisted on singing a karaoke-style love song to the groom, which wouldn't have been so bad, except her singing was beyond terrible. It was one of those performances where the entire room just sat in stunned silence, unsure how to react. Then there was the photographer situation. The groom had casually asked a professional photographer friend to shoot the wedding a year in advance, but never followed up. The photographer had even declined the invite because he was going to be out of the country. Yet somehow, the groom was shocked when no one showed up to take professional photos. The groomsmen were all required to rent ridiculously expensive tuxedos, but the groom wanted his own custom-tailored. He requested something flashy and over-the-top, but balked at the cost and demanded they make it work for a fraction of the price. The result? The groomsman looked sharp while he looked like a clown without makeup. To top it all off, a friend had brewed a custom batch of mead specifically for the wedding toast, but the venue didn't allow outside alcohol, so it couldn't be used. It wasn't just the cringiest wedding I'd ever attended, it might have been the cringiest event I'd ever seen. Story 28. I debated whether or not to share this, but my aunt's wedding was pure chaos. She and her new husband got married in an old movie theater, and the ceremony started on a weird note. The officiant was in full goth attire. They exchanged vows, and then the groom announced he had written a song about my aunt. He was in a rock band, so he pulled out an electric guitar and started performing. The song? It wasn't a romantic ballad. It was an explicit, vulgar track about their sex life, detailing how she tasted what they did together, and just way too much information. The goth officiant accompanied him on drums. Meanwhile, their children, family, and my aunt's father were all watching. Once he was done, they mixed different types of alcohol in a giant margarita glass to symbolize their unity, and then made out in front of everyone. My brother and I left soon after. We did attend the wedding dinner later that night, which was equally as bizarre. Safe to say, we don't keep in touch much. Story 29. This couple staged an entire damsel in distress scenario at their wedding. The bride pretended to be in trouble, while the groom, dressed as James Bond, ziplined into the venue to rescue her. They had the 007 theme playing and everything. It was supposed to be dramatic and fun, but the whole thing dragged on awkwardly. Watching the groom struggle with the zip line while everyone forced polite laughter made it even worse. Then, after his big rescue, they had a slow motion style kiss in front of everyone. It was brutal to sit through. Story 30. In Poland, I helped prepare food for a wedding along with my mom, some aunts, and even neighbors. The groom wanted to save money, so we spent hours making pierogi and other traditional dishes, thinking it would be a nice bonding experience. Turns out we were just unpaid labor. The neighbors who helped weren't even invited to the wedding. Then, at the reception, things got worse. The bride had control over the catering since the waiters were her friends, so she decided who got what food. Story 31. This wedding was a disaster from the start. Right after leaving the church, guests lined up to congratulate the couple and give them envelopes, a common tradition. The bride kept track, signing each envelope or writing down the names of those who didn't give one. Then, on the way to the reception, they made an unscheduled stop to count the money. By the time they finally arrived at the venue, they were angry because they hadn't received enough to cover the wedding costs. The way they treated guests reflected this. The wealthier family members got the best food, while the less important tables received smaller portions or none at all. Some guests, myself included, didn't even get forks, just spoons, because apparently soup was the only thing we were worthy of eating. I had donated enough money to cover 5 guests and had even baked cakes for the wedding, cakes I never got to eat. Many guests left within 20 minutes. The bride threw a fit, claiming they had ruined her dream wedding, the worst wedding I've ever been to. And that's only part of the mess. The groom was cheap and the bride was a full-blown Karen. I wish I had a car back then, so I could have left even sooner. Story 32. An acquaintance of mine had a wedding with a truly bizarre twist. I didn't attend, but a mutual friend who was there told me all about it. During the ceremony, the pastor advised the couple to divorce their friends because apparently it would make their marriage stronger. And they actually followed that advice. After the wedding and reception, they completely cut off contact with all the friends who had been there to celebrate their big day. Just disappeared from their lives. I assumed they wouldn't last a year, but somehow they're still together. I guess in their world, married couples aren't allowed to have friends. Story 33. A bride showed up almost 2 hours late to her own wedding. The ceremony was in an open field in Southern California. No shade, no water, and a whole lot of uncomfortable guests baking in the sun. When she finally arrived, she was wearing a yoga outfit. The groom immediately shut it down. He refused to go through with the wedding unless she changed into her actual wedding dress. She refused. So he left. Right then and there, he walked away and left her standing there, looking ridiculous. Later, I found out from my uncle that the groom had suspected she was cheating with her personal trainer. When she showed up to the wedding in yoga gear, that was all the confirmation he needed. She ended up marrying the trainer and then divorcing him too. Story 34. This wedding had a surprise twist. The couple used the ceremony as a name reveal. They had legally changed their last name, explaining that they didn't want to be tied to their heritage and wanted a fresh start. What they didn't mention was that they did it because they were drowning in debt and thought a name change would somehow erase it, or at least help them hide from creditors. Turns out, you can't just live under 2 legal identities. It doesn't work that way. Story 35. My dad went to a wedding where the bride and groom staged a whole dramatic scene before making their grand entrance. Guests inside the venue watched a live-streamed video of the couple searching for each other. Then they entered from opposite sides of the room, met in the middle, and did a choreographed dance with their friends before finally having their first dance. It was definitely different. Story 36. At my wedding, my mom and mother-in-law insisted on doing a sztuczę, a kind of theatrical skit meant to humorously roast the bride and groom, usually with embarrassing childhood photos. We explicitly told them not to do one, but they went ahead anyway, and the whole thing was painfully awkward. Guests were visibly annoyed and uncomfortable. When it finally ended, we were relieved, thinking we could just move on with the party. Then my mother-in-law got up and did another skit. At that point, we were ready to strangle her. Story 37. At a wedding I attended, the groom attempted to throw a large piece of cake at the bride. She dodged, and it ended up hitting my 76-year-old grandmother instead. We all laughed, but at the same time, it was hard not to cringe at how badly it backfired. Story 38. Oh, I've got two stories. At one wedding, the bride sang as she walked down the aisle. She wasn't a particularly good singer, but that wasn't even the worst part. She was singing over a Carrie Underwood song, meaning we could all hear both her voice and the original track at the same time. She finished walking about halfway through the song, but instead of stopping, she stood there and kept singing while everyone else just awkwardly watched. At a different wedding, the groom kicked things off by playing a horribly out-of-tune guitar and singing to the bride. They sat on chairs in front of 400 people while he strummed and crooned, looking deeply into her eyes. The bride was visibly uncomfortable, which only made it worse for everyone watching. That wedding also included a foot washing ceremony. When the bride went to put her shoes back on, she tripped on her dress, face planted, and gave herself a nosebleed. The ceremony had to be paused for 20 minutes to deal with it, before they had even said their vows. Story 39. At one wedding, only the bridal party was served macaroni and cheese. Everyone else got mashed potatoes. I was working as a hostess and got a plate with mac and cheese, but after tasting it, I knew it wouldn't have been a financial burden to make enough for everyone. It wasn't anything special. It was just really tacky because guests were asking for it, and all I could do was shrug and say, I was just following instructions. Story 40. I went to a wedding with my ex that was painfully conservative. The bride's parents were so strict that they had edited versions of every song played by the DJ. It was a dry wedding, so when LMFAO's shots came on, every instance of the word shots had been bleeped out. It was almost too on the nose. Story 41. The bride walked into the Braveheart soundtrack, blasting from a boombox. The civil ceremony itself lasted just a few minutes. She then exited to the same blaring Braveheart music. At that point, the mother of the bride stood up and announced that the reception wouldn't start until 5:30 p.m., over 4 hours later. No food, no bar, just trays of dessert bars later. Also, the venue was locked until then, so there was nowhere for guests to wait. Naturally, a group of us crossed the street to an Irish pub, and a bit of an impromptu party broke out. After a while, we got scolded and told to wait at the venue instead. So we sat on the carpet in the hallway, thirsty and hungry, just waiting. When the reception finally began, the bride and groom made their entrance under an honor guard of hockey players holding sticks above their heads like swords. Of course, Braveheart played again. Most people left early, either back to the pub or to grab fast food. Our dinner ended up being lemon squares and a can of Coke from a vending machine. To top it off, I got guilt-tripped into staying late to help clean up, since I lived nearby and didn't have to work the next day. The perfect ending. Story 42. At the beginning of the reception, we were all asked to stand up and sing the national anthem. This was in a country where I had never attended a wedding before, so I assumed it was a cultural tradition. But when I mentioned it to other people later, they all confirmed, no, that was just weird. The groom's father also gave a speech that ended with what he clearly thought was a killer joke. It's easier to build a bridge to Hawaii than to understand what a woman is thinking. Would have been awkward enough on its own, but the man was standing between his ex-wife and his new wife as he said it. Story 43. My family has a strange habit of turning any gathering into a time to remember deceased relatives. That alone is uncomfortable for me, but it reaches a whole new level of weirdness when wedding speeches and even vows start mentioning great uncles who passed away years ago. It's never in a meaningful way either. The speeches will just randomly include lines like, if only Uncle Barney were alive to see this. The problem is the only people who actually knew Uncle Barney are my grandparents, so the rest of us are left awkwardly nodding along. To be fair, no one in my family is particularly good at giving speeches. My parents can only make joke speeches, while my uncle and his family recite dry, lifeless lists of things they've done. His wedding speech for his son was a 10-minute monologue about kitchen renovations. One of my aunts only gives speeches when there's something to brag about, so if there are no accomplishments, she simply doesn't speak. Then there's the aunt who insists on turning every speech into a tribute to someone who has passed away. There's no winning. Story 44. It's a toss-up between my sister breaking her knee at her own wedding while dancing to Cotton Eye Joe and my stepsister having her reception at an actual truck stop while 6 months pregnant. The truck stop wedding was especially strange. The food was good, but walking through a gas station in formal wear made the whole experience surreal. Story 45. The couple sang their vows to each other, which would have been sweet if either of them could actually sing. Unfortunately, they couldn't. The vows themselves were completely unhinged, including promises of submission in the bedroom and never questioning where the bride was going. As if that wasn't bad enough, they used auto-tune microphones, which made everything sound even more painful. They had also written a shared chorus and expected the guests to sing along. Story 46. The speeches at this wedding were unbearable. The reception was supposed to start immediately after the ceremony, but it was at a different location. Guests were not allowed to eat until the wedding party arrived. Unfortunately, the bride and groom, along with their friends, decided to spend 2 hours cruising around in a party bus and drinking instead of heading straight to the venue. When they finally showed up, they didn't let anyone eat right away. Instead, they decided to start the speeches, one after another. The best man, the maid of honor, multiple parents, and even a few random guests gave long-winded, uninteresting speeches. The whole thing dragged on for over an hour. For 3 hours, guests sat with no food, no music, and no open bar, only water. Nearly everyone, including me, left as soon as dinner was over. It was unbelievably disrespectful to the guests. Story 47. As a wedding videographer for 10 years, I only encountered one true bridezilla. This bride was so self-absorbed that she kept everyone waiting at her outdoor ceremony for over an hour while she sat in the makeup chair, demanding constant touch-ups. Meanwhile, she casually brainstormed her wedding vows in a way that felt completely inappropriate, considering there were 100 guests sweating under the full summer sun. At one point, her aunt gently reminded her that people were waiting and it had been over an hour. Instead of acknowledging the delay, the bride threw a full tantrum, screaming, "I feel like everyone's forgetting this is my day." When she finally emerged, her vows were incoherent and forgettable. As the ceremony dragged on, one of groomsmen, suffering under the heat in a full suit, passed out from heat exhaustion. The officiant quietly asked if they should pause to check on him, but the bride dismissed it, saying, "Nah, he's just being dramatic. Keep going." By the time the ceremony ended and the couple walked back up the aisle, an ambulance had arrived to treat the overheated groomsmen. Story 48. The minister at this wedding had previously dated the bride. That alone was weird enough, but then he spent part of the ceremony gushing about how wonderful she was. At one point, he even turned to the groom and said, "If you ever die, don't worry, I'll take care of her." I was completely stunned. I would have loved to get a copy of that wedding video, but I couldn't think of a legitimate reason to ask for one. Story 49. At a wedding in upstate New York, the minister's cell phone rang in the middle of the ceremony. Instead of ignoring it, he answered the call. He then announced that it was God on the line. God apparently wanted to speak to the groom, so the minister handed over the phone, and they had a brief conversation before the ceremony continued as if nothing had happened. Story 50. Before our wedding, we had planned to have my husband's family friend, a pastor, officiate. I'm not religious, but I was open to it since my husband's late mother had been a Sunday school teacher, and his family was fairly religious. When we met with the pastor at his home to go over the ceremony, he asked if I was going to center my marriage around God. I answered honestly, no. The mood instantly shifted. What followed was an uncomfortable back and forth about why I wouldn't accept Jesus and how awful that was. He also made it clear he didn't approve of us getting married at a country club. Eventually, he refused to do the wedding at all. With little time to spare, we scrambled to find a replacement and ended up getting married by the town's mayor. On the day of the wedding, the mayor mentioned she had recently had back surgery and just wanted to get this over with. She kept calling my husband Eric. His name is Evan. And at one point, she went off script while clearly high on painkillers. If you've ever seen I Now Pronounce You Chuck and Larry, she basically did that marriage as a circle speech. It took everything in us not to burst out laughing. Meanwhile, the pastor who had refused to marry us showed up anyway and watched the whole thing. We even got a picture with him. Later, he and his wife cropped us out of it and made it his profile picture. Story 51. One of my favorite memories from my years as a cater waiter was a long Indian wedding where endless relatives gave long, heartfelt toasts. Just when it felt like it would never end, an uncle stood up, took the microphone, and simply said, "I made him waffles once." Then he sat back down. Bless that man, wherever he is. Toasts in general tend to be painful. Too many inside jokes, embarrassing stories, and people who just don't know when to stop talking. Keep it short, sweet, and genuine. No one wants to sit through a 15-minute speech that only makes sense to 3 people. Story 52. One bride required every guest to bring a date because she didn't want sad, lonely people on her day. I wasn't close to her, but I pretended to be a friend's date just so she could attend her cousin's wedding. Story 53. I attended a potluck wedding with no alcohol or music. The groom, trying to be sneaky, kept flashing a flask and bragging about it like it was some big secret. The only redeeming thing was the macaroni, until I went to scoop some and saw a hair in it. That about summed up the entire event. Story 54. At one wedding, the pastor kept referring to God as our Heavenly Father, Daddy God. For context, it was a military wedding held in Hawaii, but it was just the couple and the pastor live streamed on Twitch. The pastor, who was probably about 25, was officiating while wearing flip-flops and a fake flower lei. It was an experience. Story 55. This wedding was a chaotic mess from start to finish. The groom changed his best man on the day of the ceremony and didn't bother telling the original best man until right before it started. During the reception, the bride and groom asked a random guest to bartend on the spot without any prior arrangement. Then came the truly uncomfortable moments. The groom dirty danced with his stepmother, full hands on ass, in front of everyone. Later, he and the bride forced their wedding party to perform a choreographed dance to Paradise by the Dashboard Light by Meatloaf. The problem? None of them had been warned or taught the dance beforehand. That song is 8.5 minutes long. The wedding was held at a scenic boarding school campus during the summer, and guests were told they could stay in the dorms for free. What they weren't told was that the dorms had no bedding and no air conditioning. Afterward, the groom emailed everyone who stayed there, asking for money. Story 56. At my cousin's wedding, my uncle gave a long speech. Instead of focusing on the newlyweds, he spent 5 full minutes talking about his daughter's ex-boyfriend and their toxic relationship. If you're ever asked to give a speech, prepare something beforehand. Story 57. At one wedding, the bouquet toss was so awkward it became a joke. The bride threw the bouquet, and every single woman in the crowd backed away. No one wanted to catch it. The DJ ended up making a joke about it, and people had a slightly awkward laugh, but it was clear that no one wanted to play along with the tradition. Story 58. My husband and I opted out of both the bouquet and garter toss because they're cringy. Instead, we did a dance where all the married couples were invited onto the dance floor. As the DJ called out increasing lengths of time, 1 hour, 1 week, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, etc., couples sat down when their number was called, leaving the longest married couple standing at the end. We gave the bouquet to them. It felt way more meaningful than forcing single guests into an awkward moment. Story 59. At my cousin's wedding, they did the garter toss. When the groom threw it, no one moved. It just landed on the floor in front of a crowd of guys who stood there completely still, refusing to catch it. After 2 more failed tosses, one guy finally bent down and half-heartedly picked it up, clearly only doing it so they could move on. The bride refused to look at any of those guys for the rest of the night. Story 60. I was photographing a wedding where the bride was marrying a man with 2 kids from a previous relationship. While in the bridal suite, I noticed all the bridesmaids were wearing matching silk robes. The flower girl, the groom's daughter, was also there. When it was time for a group photo, I saw one woman in a silk robe awkwardly standing off to the side. Thinking she was just shy, I motioned for her to join the group. The room went dead silent. The bride glared at me and snapped, "Oh no, we don't want her in the photos." Turns out the woman in the matching robe was the groom's ex-wife. She was only there to take care of the flower girl. If she wasn't supposed to be part of the wedding party, why did they give her a matching robe? I wanted to crawl into a hole and die. Story 61. I've worked in the wedding industry for years and have been to over 3,000 weddings. Here's some advice. Never sing your vows. It will never go as you imagined it in your head. Never attempt to sing any part of your wedding. It always ends in secondhand embarrassment. A wedding day is not the time for surprises. Don't surprise the bride with an unexpected part of the ceremony. Don't surprise your mother by springing a wedding on her at what she thought was an engagement dinner. Yes, that actually happened. The only exception is if you're surprising the bride with a sentimental addition to her ring, like a family diamond or a custom band made from her parents' rings. If you're going to be late, tell people. Have your partner, parents, or someone in the wedding party spread the message. The staff especially needs to know. If you forget the rings, don't stress it. It's a funny story later. If you forget your vows, do your best to improvise or ask the officiant for a quick rescue. Just don't panic and definitely don't try to turn it into a song. And most importantly, don't get drunk and make a fool of yourself. No one wants to be that guy. Plus, if you're too drunk, you won't even be able to enjoy your wedding night.